Welcome. Happy New Year. Sort of. My name is Marisa Gomez, and I'm the Public Programs Manager of the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. Really happy to have you all here with us tonight. Before we get too far into things, I did want to ask everyone to take a moment to adjust your chat settings by clicking where it says to all panelists and changing it to say panelists and attendees. And while you're at it, you can practice using the chat. We'd love to hear from you all throughout the night. And so since we're going to be exploring photography as a tool of historic understanding, way of directing our attention towards nature, and of understanding our natural world, let's chat about nature photos. Why don't you share what's the most recent picture you took out in nature? What was it of? Where were you at? What caught your attention most recently? Put it out in the chat and share it with all panelists and attendees. And this is how we can say hello to each other tonight. I will share that this is the most recent nature photo on my phone. And it's similar to many of the nature photos that are on my phone. So many of them have the Museum of Natural History in the background or feature mushrooms heavily. So that's what I got on the brain recently. 'Tis the season for mushrooms. So yeah, please let us know what you've been taking pictures of. I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the land from which I am joining you and the land on which the museum resides is the traditional and unceded territory of the Weepy tribe of the Awaswas Nation. Today, these lands are stewarded by the Amamutsan Tribal Band. The Amamutsan are working hard to fulfill the obligation to Creator, to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the Amamutsan Land Trust, and we are ever grateful for their work and partnership. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And also, I just wanted to start off by saying that these Collections Close-Up events are a special focus for our museum members, who we invite to take a closer look at our collections every month, both through these webinars and also with a monthly blog written by our Collections Manager Kathleen Aston, who I am joined by tonight. And so I wanted to take a special moment to thank you all so much for being a part of our member community. As a nonprofit organization, we rely entirely on community contributions in order to steward our collections, host public events, connecting people with cultural and scientific experts, and tell the story of our natural world through exhibits and virtual experiences. So thanks for helping to make that happen through your membership. And also, I know so many of you who registered tonight also made additional donations in the process. And we are so grateful for that every time we see that. Thank you so much. And know that when we share these stories of our collections, you're directly connected to those stories. And so without further ado, I want to get into the main event. And we're going to start with some history from Kathleen Aston, as usual. Hello, Kathleen.
Oh, hello. And so one of the things, the story that we are going to talk about this month, and also, guys, I am going to share my screen and do a better job of advancing slides than last time. So be here with me on that one, all of you. Thank you. So we're going to focus on, if any of you guys have read the blog this month, which will be included in the series of resources we send out at the after the event. We're going to start with some of our foundational photographs. So for us, our foundational collection is the Laura Hicks collection. So those of us who are maybe new to her story, she was a lady lighthouse keeper in Santa Cruz in the late 18th and early 19th century. She was an incredible woman with a variety of skills, and naturalist who was well known and communicated with scientists of the day about her observations. And so in a way, connecting more to Laura's story is also us connecting more, to thinking about the natural world, getting people excited about it, engaged in it, and thinking about how that's something that's accessible to all of us if you just, go and engage with nature and look around. And you can see this iconic photo of Laura Hicks beneath a bridge, a natural bridge, is one that we use in a lot of our outreach about her, especially around months like this, because January is the anniversary of Laura Hicks's birthday, and so we do try to remember and especially celebrate her this month. And a lot of these iconic images come from the very few pieces of visual evidence that we have about Laura's life. So within our foundational collections, we have, some elements of what was once Laura's original collection of natural history specimens. We have artifacts and curios. We have a couple of ledger notebooks where she wrote down information about some specimens, but we don't have a lot about her personally, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And some of you guys, I'm sure, have heard me talk about that before. I'm really curious about her. I think it's important to learn more about her. And so we have these two albums. And then also, I guess, let me put a couple dates in context. So Laura herself was born in 1854. Her family moved to the Lighthouse when it first opened in 1870, where her father, Odney Hicks, was the first lighthouse keeper. And you can see that this image is dated in 1888. So Laura would have been, math, 34? Likely, yeah, because it was September. And so we have these pictures are one of the main ways that we, have a sense of what she was up to. And one thing we talk a lot about is her tide pooling in petticoats. It was a lot in the clothing of the day to get down there and take a look at things and get your hands dirty. So we have two of these main albums. And the story I'm going to tell here is one that I've told in the blog, which is about us learning something new about one of the photographs in these albums, and thinking a lot about how when we're using photographs to understand the world, the more information we have about those photographs can help change sometimes in surprising ways the understanding and the information we find there visually. So we have two of these main albums, and these are some photos from it. You can see it here. It says yours truly, T.H. de Estrella, 1887. So that was Theophilus de Estrella, who was a family friend of the Hickokses and visited them at times. He was a teacher at the California School for the Deaf, where he was also one of the first students. And so when it says my class up there in that top right-hand corner picture, that's probably what he's talking about. So he put together one of these albums that has a lot of photos of Berkeley and the East Bay broadly, a couple, larger adventures in California, sculptures by Theo's friend, Douglas Tilden, who was Laura's nephew, and landscapes and pictures of Santa Cruz, including images of the family. So that's one of the albums that we had. And you can see, something I'm going to talk a little bit about this is in this talk is handwriting. And so you can see the inscriptions. That's something to note, the style of sort of tightly coiled cursive that we're seeing there. So the next album that we have, is the same exact, it was a mass-produced photo album cover type that it was bound in. And you can see there's also a lot of pictures of Santa Cruz. Here are some examples. You've got Phelan Park, which is near what is now Lighthouse Field, was once part of that property. You've got, Cliff Road in Santa Cruz, some of the, coastline that is still iconic to us today, although it has changed. We'll talk more about that. And you can see that you have this sort of a lot of these images are dated and captured in this sort of loopier, looser cursive handwriting. And in the second album, not every single image is captioned, but where they are, they're mostly in both albums dated between 1887 or 1888. And so, looking for more information, this helps us understand where these, this is a snapshot in time of these actual physical spaces, and also understands perhaps where Laura or whoever bound these particular albums was putting their attention towards. And so it was, it's thinking about who had access to photographic equipment at the time that these albums were made, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Photography wasn't a widespread hobby for a lot of folks due to how complicated it had been to put together all the chemicals and carry them around and have these longer exposures. It wasn't as popular or as accessible until 1888 when some developments occurred to make it so that that process was easier. And so these images were being taken at a time where, it wasn't super normal. Of course, nothing like today, but it wasn't super normal for people to necessarily have access to photography. And so one of the pictures in one of the two albums, so I like to think about it as like Theo's Christmas album, and then the other album is how I tend to think about them in my mind, is this image. And there are several images of the family around the lighthouse. You can, from other photographs, we know that that's Margaret Hicks, or, up until recently, we're pretty clear on that, standing on the porch. There's a gentleman to her right, and then there's a gentleman to her left who is Theophilus de Estrella. He's in some other photographs from that album, more clearly labeled, and then we have some pictures of him from comparable times. But this is the image in the album. And so, you just see folks standing at the lighthouse. It gives us a sense of like there were gardens being tended. There's some other images of the book of Laura actually gardening. So if we then flip to this next slide, here is the more exciting new thing that we were able to learn about this photograph is, you have more information about who's actually pictured there. We have what appears to be a W.J. Morton mother. It's confirmed that that's Margaret. Theophilus de Estrella is confirmed. We find out that from this caption that this picture was taken the day before Thanksgiving in November of 1887. And also partially obscured in the corner is what appears to be the phrase, "I took this photo." And so you see this handwriting is pretty similar in a lot of ways to that big open loopy cursive. And given the context in which we obtained the photo, it seems pretty clear that Laura actually took this photo, which is pretty cool given that at the time it was not the most accessible thing. And given that we don't have a lot of things that were directly authored by her as a person, a lot of times we're learning about her sort of obliquely. So just a little bit of background on how this came to us. This image is courtesy of Frank Falwell, who is a descendant of Laura's mother's family. And so you get all these letters between Margaret, Laura's mother, and her family, who's back on the East Coast, where she's just talking to them about how much she misses them and how much she wishes she could see them again. So Margaret Hicks was born in 1815, died in 1908, and herself contributed to history an account of her and her family when her children were young, around the same time as the Donner Party. She has a book called California Caravan that's about the challenging journey that it took to get out west and the physical costs and the discomfort and the fear and the challenges all around. And she, when she first married her husband, Adna, had gotten from him a promise that he would eventually take her back to her family on the East Coast. And due to a couple of reasons, one of which probably was some health concerns on Adna's part, they ended up heading out west, where Margaret eventually learned to love it here, but for many years just really sorely missed her family. And so, in part of this exchange, at one point, this image was sent back to one of her relatives. And so for our institution, for that, family connection and that record of that like affection and love, that's really important on a personal level. But then this caption is giving us so much information as a public institution, sharing a story about a figure who inspires us to this day. So that is sort of, the crux of this duality that we have in like many objects, but photographs in particularly, because they're able to tell us this visual record that can give us one kind of information, and then the context can adjust that in a really surprising way like this one. So some other, ways that we're thinking about like having records of Laura's life and how we're like coming to this understanding that she was, pretty likely the photographer of that picture. We have here her remarks to the federal government in some Lighthouse reports that she was required to submit about wrecks whenever any shipwrecks were happen in the vicinity of the light. We have her shell book. This is a catalog record from there in which we have sort of two different kind of handwritings. And that's part of why this caption is also so important to us, is being able to find another comparison point to the author of these different writings, because there are, a couple different kinds of handwriting in some of her limited catalog records that we have. And the documents that she was giving to the federal government, we can feel pretty strongly that that was her hand. It was supposed to be, she was the one who had the responsibility to do that. But in the catalog books, it gets a little bit trickier, because we also have, records of, Margaret, her mother, or, family members helping to organize specimens. So you can see in this newspaper clipping from 1905, before her collection was, as her collection was being transferred to the city, And you also have, in newspaper records from that time and even from later when the museum collections were being relocated to Seabright, you have this idea that the collection is actually the Adna Hicks collection. And Adna, could very well have also been interested in these things. We know that he built cabinets to house parts of Laura's collection and clearly supported it. She worked with him a lot in doing Lighthouse work before she was appointed after his death. And so we don't want to eliminate anyone's participation in this story, but it is really interesting to think about more ways we can talk about the agency of this particular woman, especially when the history of women in science is so often obscured or not discussed. So that's really cool for us to be able to do. Looking back at the albums after the image that was lent to us by Frank Falwell is something I first, when I first encountered it, I was like, this could be a really compelling piece of evidence in favor of Laura picking up and using a camera, which is rad. And one of the reasons why, another piece of evidence in that favor is whereas not all of those images are captioned, the ones that are captioned often do have explicit attribution for other photographers. So you have here that this Cliff Road Santa Cruz was the compliments of Chas Wilkinson. You have these cactus. And you can see in the corner it says DE 1887. And so we know that, in other cases where Laura didn't take the photographs, she was attributing them to other people, which also opens up the possibility that these photographs that aren't directly attributed are potentially other images that she herself took, which itself is also pretty cool, thinking about her as like an early nature photographer in some ways. And again, this is something where we're looking at the evidence and we're, trying to make evidence-based assessments, but really being able to probe the possibilities of the past is important when you weren't there and you can't necessarily, you might not have the opportunity to have a piece of evidence that's going to make a confirmation for you of a particular fact. But anyway, so these are some photos, more Cliff Road, like arches and beach scenes. Something else that I thought was really cool, like a standout from this album is you can see that this other picture from 1888 says near Leonard Lake where we camped. So we have information that Laura did take some trips, but she was, for most of her adult life, pretty firmly bound to the responsibilities of the Lighthouse. And so it's exciting to think about these opportunities where she maybe got to do something like camping, which I'm sure we all miss right now. And so, when I think about learning this new fact about her from this, learning this from this new piece of information, this new piece of evidence, this caption, one thing that really, sticks to my mind is all of these iconic images in these two photograph albums and how, intrepid she looks in this under the arch photo where she's looking out into the sea or maybe like making an observation about a creature, and how it is placed next to a picture of lynxes in Santa Cruz from, potentially around the same time, and thinking about how I just really like how human of a portrait this paints of this person who is also, a historical figure, but also, was someone for whom maybe cat pictures mattered as much, in 1888 as they do to a lot of people in 2021. And so that is sort of our first big foray into one aspect of our collections that really are changing our understanding of how we relate to our founder, and from there expanding like how we might talk about this person who we use to try to connect people to nature. But we do really quickly want to discuss, the greater context around how these photograph albums potentially, for sure, the one from Theophilus de Estrella and, the other one, it seemed like some of those images were also his, how that connection was built into the Hicks family life. So Theophilus de Estrella was a really good friend of Laura's nephew, Douglas Tilden, who was born in 1860 and lived till 1935. And so he was a well-known sculptor. You can see in this clipping that Laura herself, who did leave behind some scrapbooks, kept a close eye on things that Douglas Tilden was up to, clearly very interested in his career. And so he was the son of her sister Catherine and her husband William Tilden. And so you can also see that the Christmas compliments album that Theo gave, and that's the signature from the front of one of the albums in the top right of the page. Maybe parallel the different trip down to Santa Cruz, where in December of 1888, he took a picture of the Santa Cruz beach and lighthouse. And he has some other iconic pictures of the lighthouse that help flesh out our, visual understanding of that place at that time. In those trips, they created a pretty close bond with the Hicks family. It sounds like when Laura's mother, Margaret, passed away, Theophilus de Estrella eulogized her as someone who was not only like an important personal friend and an impressive woman, but also someone who was a big friend to the deaf community, of which he and Douglas Tilden were a part. So the photographs I'm about to show more of in the next picture are from Mildred Albronda's The Magic Lantern Man. It's a biography that's actually really an interesting read about Theophilus de Estrella's life. He was something of a renowned amateur photographer in California in the late 1800s and super active in the Sierra Club and the California Camera Club, which took these big excursion hikes all over California to explore things, to take pictures, and then to share them with folks in events and society meetings. So you can see this is a picture of some students from the California School for the Deaf who walked up to some hills outside of Berkeley, and this is a class at the California School for the Deaf. Theophilus de Estrella was the first student admitted to what is now the California School for the Deaf in 1860. And he also later was the first deaf student who was admitted to UC Berkeley, where he studied science for several years. He was a Renaissance man. He was involved in literary societies. He met John Muir while hiking mostly on foot to Yosemite from the Bay Area. And he was really interested in connecting to people and methods of visual communication. He took his first photograph in 1886 and pretty rapidly became a very serious student. Not only was he really excited about taking photographs, and you can see this really great picture of him coming out of a dugout darkroom in Oregon in 1892. That was probably on a group trip with the California Camera Club. He was also really passionate about sharing these, not just his skills. You can see his drawing class in the top right corner, but also sharing his passion of nature with his students. And so this is a picture of a magic lantern cabinet type, one of the more affordable ones from, an older catalog from around the turn of the 18th, 19th century. And this was just a device where you could take your image and you could print it on slides and then you could project it. And so Theo, I think that let's see. So he began showing magic lantern slides at the school in 1888. So by this time he was already, we mentioned a little bit earlier about sort of some stuff to do with the history of photography. The first photograph, the first modern photograph was taken in 1826. It took about 8 hours to develop, and it was a picture of a barn. And a couple years later, around 10 years later, the daguerreotype was invented, which was a method of photography that still involved all these elaborate chemical processes where you're allowing light to filter in to a light-sensitive material and then using various chemicals to fix that image into that material and then stop that development process. It only took a 20-minute exposure with the daguerreotype, but then it took until about 1888 when George Eastman first released the first Kodak camera. And the big thing about the first Kodak camera was that they offered not just to give you the camera, but it came with a 100 roll exposure of film. And it was really easy for then you to take all your pictures you wanted, ship it back to the factory and get things developed. So you weren't trying to lug around all these poisonous chemicals. You weren't having to deal with those nuances. So things became more broadly popular at that time, 1888. But for Theo, this was something he was a more serious student with. So he was probably doing, working with different kinds of cameras than that one probably, but we're not sure what techniques he was necessarily using for the Hicks family albums that he contributed to. But he did buy his first handheld camera in 1895, which was also the year he took his first excursion with the California Camera Club to the Russian River, and the members of that group took 500 photographs and were astounded that they were able to do so much. And a lot of those photographs that he would take of nature were things that he would also then, images like this that he would then bring back and show in magic lantern slides to his class, which is where he earned the nickname the Magic Lantern Man. So unfortunately, and it was really important for him even before he was doing the slides, the photographs, when he was working with students at the California School for the Deaf, he would always be taking people out onto walks, wanting to give them a variety of experiences, as many different kinds of skills as possible, but also really interested in getting them engaged with the natural world. Unfortunately, a fire in 1910 destroyed his photo lab, which included all of his equipment, including like 5 cameras and a whole bunch of, chemicals and things, and over 2,000 negatives. So this stopped his active photography career, but he kept going on Sierra Club and Camera Club trips up until the year before his death in 1929. And so we're really lucky that a lot of these photographs were preserved in the collections of the School for the California, or the collections for the California School for the Deaf, so that we're able to have more of this visual record. But at the same time, that's another nice example where you see when different organizations like that school or this museum are able to steward various collections, it's insurance against that kind of disaster. So we do still have photographs taken by De Estrella. We're really glad that they still have their collection, but it's useful to think about, as many different cultural institutions, collaborating to care for things into the future. And that brings us sort of to our next section. Well, I know that I'm going a little bit briskly, which is a habit of mine. But we're going to talk a little bit more about, in this picturing nature section, about some strengths of the museum's photograph collection and how that, is an opportunity to think about different relationships we have with nature. So beyond our foundational photographs, we have several hundred images in our collections. They're largely historical. Many of them are stunning landscapes like this one. We like to have as much context for our photographs as I've talked about, but is the cool thing about visual records, is that they can speak beyond whatever information you necessarily have explicitly associated with them because they show you something. And so, for example, in our collections, we have early logging activities in the Santa Cruz Mountains, images of them. And that can help us understand things like how changes in the environment are a response to developing technologies. But we also have to acknowledge that I know I have some friends who really think that pictures of cows are adorable. And I also have some friends who think that pictures of railroad tracks are adorable. So those are also, we don't want to discount the aesthetic value of any particular thing just because it's not, in a traditional landscape photograph sense, a picture. So one area that really stood out to me when I was exploring sort of the images in our collections that might speak to this theme is how photographs that shape our appreciation of nature then in turn affect how we as a civilization shape nature. So thinking about the relationship between photography and conservation. So our collections are pretty strong in images like mounted pictures like this one, or postcards of the Santa Cruz redwoods and forests and other iconic landscapes. This was a photographer who had a shop on Santa Cruz on Pacific Avenue called George Webb, and we have a number of these beautiful old mounted photo cards. And a lot of them have these really charismatic pictures of the big trees. And so, we have like hordes of these postcards of the big trees, which, is now where Henry Cowell is, and other, exotic or other iconic flora and fauna. From the 1900s, the early 1900s to, of course, present day, these things are still really popular. And it suggests how not only did we value having these things for ourselves, but this transfer to postcards suggests that we value sharing that with other people and connecting over that with other people. And so having these charismatic images is critical to conservation. A lot of historians associate the advent of photography in particular and early pictures of things like the California redwoods with the success of, big conservation movements like establishing things like national parks, like the Save the Redwoods has this great piece talking about how Carlton Watkins' giant sequoia photographs from the 1850s helped inspire the government at the time to protect Yosemite Valley. So people are sharing their love for nature, and hopefully they're sharing their interest in caring for it. And so that's one way that, we might think about this reciprocal relationship between, appreciation and then, changes in behavior. But, another thing that people might do is use, they're in some cases sharing pictures of trees to talk about trees. In some cases, like this one, you're sharing a picture of an arch to talk about how cool you thought it was to a friend of yours in Illinois that you got to see a Santa Cruz cypress. So sometimes you're using pictures of the beach to talk about trees. And so that again speaks to sort of this compelling feature of photographs, to really like get people excited about something. And we think about that a lot. And we've been thinking about that, especially as we gear towards our exhibit, which we'll talk with Marisa in a couple moments. But I did also want to think about one of the strengths in our collection being how, images are able to shape our understanding of the changing coast. And so this double arch used to exist on the west side near what is now Woodrow Avenue. And we'll include a link to a Mobile Ranger article talking about the hunt for where this particular arch might have been. It's a little bit tricky, but people in Santa Cruz have been interested, over the decades in these interesting features of the coastal landscape, and they've been sharing pictures of them and trying to understand about where they were and where they might come again. One disclaimer that we do want to add is that when you're looking at, especially postcards, but also, older photographs, you can't necessarily take them at face value when we're thinking about, how these images can be used to understand change and what their informational value can be, even though they were maybe originally used for personal purposes. We can't take them always at face value. You can see that these two postcards of, the same picture were altered in different ways. And just because it wasn't as easy at the time to alter photographs as it is today, doesn't mean that that wasn't something that didn't happen, or in the case of postcards as well. And we're also going to include a link to a really great article written by Frank Perry, sort of about, examining how people were manipulating different images into postcards of the arches and the coast here in town. And of course, speaking of great articles, if you haven't yet treated yourself to any of the work that Gary Griggs has done documenting the changing California ghost, you should definitely check it out. So historic images of, like, for example, the arches in particular, a really charismatic feature, have often been used to understand the shifts in the landscape over the years. You can see these, which were taken from Gary's article on the natural bridges of Santa Cruz County. The top is natural bridges in 1890, 1970, and 2006, and then Crown Arch in the early 1900s for a couple times through 2016, and 4 Mile Beach in 1969, 1987, and 1995. And so one of the things this can tell us about is, the sort of the weather patterns, the power of the waves and how that's shaping the earth, the landscape, what life can live there, how different kinds of rock is going to respond differently to different environmental stressors. So these are all the sorts of things that you might learn in addition to just change from looking at these sorts of images. Now, we talked a little bit at times about the technologies involved in, photographing nature, and that itself could be there's several books about that, more than several, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about aerial photographs. We don't have a strong aerial photograph collection, but there's a lot of strong aerial photography that speaks to this particular topic. There's the California Coastal Records Project, which was used by Gary Griggs and Deepika Shrattha Ross to talk about in their book, The California Coast from the Air, which is really good. And there's also, of course, the collections of aerial photographs that exist at UCSC and in other local institutions featuring the changing landscape from, I think, as early as about 1928 up until the present day. And of course, aerial photography is used from a variety of things to understanding climate change, to responding to natural disasters, to even the very basics of, mapping and helping us understand spatially where things are at. And so, it continues to this modern day. So before I let you guys go completely to Marisa talking even more about the modern day, I did want to touch briefly on sort of one little case study in thinking about, the value of photographs and our relationship with nature, because our mission is connecting people to science, nature and science to inspire stewardship of the natural world. And so when we collect things, we want to be really mindful that what we're doing is giving ourselves the opportunity to facilitate, to support our mission through those collections. So in 2018, we had the opportunity to collect a set of photographs, ephemera, and memorabilia that belonged to Louis Scholl of the Schollmore Castle. That was an iconic feature in Seabright for many years. A lot of folks still remember it very fondly. A lot of folks wish they had gotten to see it in person, but love the pictures of it. So a lot of this collection, which belonged to Bob Watson, Louis Scholl's nephew, is not necessarily the kind of thing like this sort of ephemera and thinking about like what kind of prices might change like at a diner is not quite in the province of a natural history museum, although we do really value celebrating our collection to the Seabright neighborhood or our relationship to the Seabright neighborhood. But in addition to these elements, these very like personal things, we were seeing a lot of images that were able to tell the visual story of the changing coastal landscape and how people were interacting with it, from bridges being built and people sunbathing to the changing width of the beach, which in response to things like the building of the harbor and, providing data from before that had happened, large storms and its effect on things like driftwood in the area. And ultimately, one thing we got really excited about was the images here that you see of folks shoring up the walls next to the castle, which allowed us to allows us an opportunity to visually think about the history of the ways that we have altered the coast, not just understood the alteration of the coast. So, the changing landscape has given us arches and also in some cases taken them away. And right now we also need to be thinking about a lot of the human actions that have changed that process fundamentally, and things like riprap and other sorts of, development. It's important for us to be aware of those, and it's interesting for us to have a visual record of that. So, we're thinking about, this is a sort of a case study and a collection that we accepted to curate and steward for the future, thinking about the possibility of these stories. But we also want to be sharing through photography in the present, and that is where we will invite Marisa back.
Hello.
To us. Hello, Marisa.
Hello. Thank you, Kathleen. And I'll have you still share on my behalf, Kathleen, if possible.
I can do that.
Thank you.
I did so well with the slides, you guys.
So well.
Very
good. I'll take this moment to just apologize to everyone for any issues you had joining us tonight with the link, but I'm glad that it worked out in the end. Sorry about that. So at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, our staff, we all wear, many hats. But also, I think some of us kind of have our niches, and Kathleen's got the old-timey stuff kind of cornered. She's our historian on record, and I'm a little bit more in the here and now. And so I'm going to share what the museum currently has going on that connects to these themes of photography being tools for connecting with nature, understanding nature, and kind of this concept that a picture taken, you don't always know the meaning of it when you're taking it. There's, in time, meaning is added. So I'm going to talk about contemporary photography topics with the museum. And upon reflecting on this topic, I realized that the photography really is a super important part of our museum operations. Since I've been on staff, we've had a number of photography-based exhibits, including last year's Mushrooms, Keys to the Kingdom Fungi exhibit, Frank Perry's Rocks and Waves exhibit exploring the geology of Westcliff Drive. I believe it was in 2019, we had our summer art series, which featured a different photographer every month. So using images to tell the story of nature is something that we do very often. And we currently have an exhibit called 2020 Vision, which is an exhibit that I'm immensely proud of and that I want to share a little bit about with you. I'm going to put the link for it in the chat here so you can peruse it now if you want a little. It's kind of hefty in terms of bandwidth. There's a lot of images in it, but I'll also be sharing a link in a follow-up email so you can explore in your own time. But this exhibit features nearly 100 images taken in Santa Cruz County during the year 2020, provided by 62 Santa Cruz County residents, about a quarter of whom are youth, which we love. And what we aim to do with this exhibit is not only tell the story of the nature of Santa Cruz County, but also provide an opportunity for not just the photographers, but also for the viewers to reflect on what was really an unprecedented year in many regards, as we all know. So we've asked our photographers to include the stories behind the images, which were very revealing and helped to add interesting context to images that you might otherwise look at on their own and think, oh, that's a really stunning sunset. But when coupled with the artist's reflections, or what the context of time or hindsight, they mean so much more. And while some of the images might have been taken explicitly to document a phenomenon of science or nature, many were probably taken with beauty in mind. This image from Elizabeth Van Dyke, if you want to go to the next slide, it tells a story that is increasingly important. It was taken at Lighthouse Field on January 4th, 2020, just over a year ago. And had it been taken a year later, based on the accounts I've heard and recent reports, you'd be hard pressed to find this many monarchs in this same location. And unfortunately, it seems that in future years, images like this will only become more poignant. Originally shot without the context of fire, this image taken from Swanton Road early in 2020 now holds new meaning, as the photographer Irene Reddy points out in this caption. It's been put in a new context as history unfolded in the CZU Lightning Complex fires tore through the region. And it's also useful for us as a museum to have images that tell the story of natural phenomena that have impacted our community for our collections, our exhibits, our programs. 2019 was the 30-year anniversary of another major natural phenomenon event for our region, the Loma Prieta earthquake. And we're grateful for photographic accounts of how that seismic event impacted our region, which allowed us to better reflect on it for the 30-year anniversary. And we had a special exhibit for that and special programming. And in tonight's program, we've been hearing from Kathleen a lot about images from the past century, viewing them as historic archives. But these contemporary images have the power to provide the same sort of useful context for future generations. This image is particularly stunning because it shows two phenomena in one photo. To the left, you see the lightning storm of August 16th, 2020, and to the right, you see the glow of the newly ignited fires. And these images from, I'm going to refer to him as Kevin P because I don't want to butcher his name, but these images from Kevin P show the fire in action, which will likely be useful for relaying these stories and reflecting on these stories in future years, and have been useful for us in the more immediate future today, looking back on the past year. And while these images from Allison Gamble and Jody Frediani show the aftermath of the fire. The image on the right is really very curatorial. It's showcasing a collection, much like one you would find at our very own museum, which is maybe one of the reasons why our staff love it so very much. And the image on the left of new growth post-fire showcases something scientifically significant, something that researchers, surveyors, conservation groups, scientists are out in the fire zone currently at this very moment, probably monitoring and looking at and trying to assess how the landscape is responding to this disturbance. So images like this over time are going to continue to be impactful. And altogether, taking an image like Irene Reddy's photograph from before the fire, and then Kevin's images of during the fire, Allison's image just after, and then continuing on in the months and years to come, it's going to continue to add to this full story for us. And while we've been chatting a lot about how meaning can be added to images over time, nature photography also has a very immediate utility in the here and now. And one of our favorite tools at the museum is iNaturalist. Shout out in the comments if you've used iNaturalist, if you love iNaturalist. And we talk about iNaturalist a lot in our public programming and have used it a lot during guided nature experiences. And frankly, we just use it a lot as staff to help us learn more about the natural world around us too. It's one of the reasons I know probably anything about insects and fungi is because I explore iNaturalist and I put my observations up on there and people help me figure out what I'm looking at. And platforms like iNaturalist allow scientists and the general public to connect and work together in creating a catalog of biodiversity all around us. And I see also in the comments, someone asked about Seek, which is also, that is an offshoot of iNaturalist. And the benefit of Seek is that it's like a really immediate, like hold it up to what you're looking at and it gives you a sense of what it might be. But the reason why I prefer iNaturalist is that you're also adding that observation as data. So you go a step further. Seek is a super cool tool. But as I'll discuss in this slide, iNaturalist has so much more to offer. So I'm going to share a little anecdote. And this is an observation from a walk I took earlier this year, so in May. And when I went on this walk through Mima Meadow, I took pictures of everything that caught my attention, whether I knew what it was or not, and then uploaded those images to iNaturalist. And in this instance, their algorithm suggested something that I thought seemed right, but it turns out that it wasn't. And so if I had been using Seek, I wouldn't have gotten this information, for instance, because Rupert here in the comments to the left, who I believe specializes in this genus and who I do not know, but he helped me to understand where I got it wrong. You can see he kind of like laid out why my original ID was unlikely and then shared with me what the ID actually is. And this helped me better understand my natural surroundings, taught me to pay closer attention, but it also likely helped people like Rupert who need data. So when we use tools like iNaturalist, we can learn a lot in the process, but we can also directly contribute to science, which is really cool. And I'll just also share that last night I was watching a video that was in honor of the Tilden Fungus Festival or Tilden Fungus Fair. I can't remember what it's called, that's going on this weekend virtually. And it was an hour of Christian Schwarz, who's a dear friend of the museum and local mycologist and just like expert in all things fungi. And it was an hour of him filming himself adding identifications to people's mushroom observations on iNaturalist. And maybe this isn't for everyone, but for me, it was so fascinating to watch an expert apply their knowledge using this tool. And a few of the observations as he was going through, he was like, whoa, what is that? Whoa, why is that there? And back to photography with iNaturalist, you don't have to know all of the botanical descriptions. You don't have to. So for this image, I'm sure Rupert could explain to me, details about the, petals and the sepals and things like that. But for me to get a correct ID for this observation, I didn't need to know that information because someone like Rupert was going through and looking at it, or someone like Christian is going through and looking at your mushrooms, and they can look at the image and figure out from the image in a lot of cases what you're looking at. So another reason why photos are totally useful for science, for deepening our understanding. And now I want to connect two of our themes that I've kind of touched on, which are fire and community science. I'm just curious, you can share in the chat, has anyone had an opportunity to visit or cause to be in an area that burned this summer, either from the CZU lightning complex or from another fire across the state? Have you had opportunity to see some of the impact of that? Waddell State Beach, I see from Trina. This is from the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve taken in October of this past year, so after the fires, biking along Swanton Road. Yeah, I've driven up Swanton Road too, and that's quite a sight to see. Bonnie Doon, Swanton, Fall Creek. Great. Yeah, so this is a really unique event that has occurred for our community and really impactful for our environment, and it's going to lead to some really interesting opportunities for observation. And I wanted to share speaking of what the museum does, how the museum uses photography, and piggybacking off of our chat about iNaturalist, we are going to be launching a project that's in partnership with other local and state organizations with the goal of empowering our community to help collect data from the CZU Lightning Complex fire zone, and then take that data and share it via platforms like iNaturalist. And this project is going to provide trainings for our community. It's going to also provide data for researchers, but can also provide a unique collection for the museum to be used in future projects that maybe we haven't even envisioned yet. But could be a future exhibit where we look back on the impact of this. And instead of curating taxidermy for an exhibit, for instance, we can curate using data and have that data really sing, because it comes with this imagery that helps to tell the story. So more on that to come. It's going to be the long haul, as I kind of touched on, looking at the impacts of fire. We want to know what's happening now, but we want to know what's happening this summer. We want to know what's happening next winter. We want to know what's happening 3 years from now. All of that data from all of these different points in time are going to be useful. And I just want to end on one final note. This is another image from our 2020 Vision exhibit. I'm sure a lot of us have images from this day that we took with our phone. And as we've discussed, people do not always take pictures with history or science in mind. I'd wager that they rarely do, actually. They take them because they find something beautiful or interesting or want to remember a moment. But we've all also benefited from images taken on a lark too, I think. Whether it might be a family photo, something that you cherish now, but in the moment it was just, the same people you see every day. Or maybe, an image taken of a building that has since been demolished. I know people in this community, when they see an image of the Cooper House, for instance, like that stirs up so many memories. Or like Kathleen showed, Castle at Castle Beach or Seabright Beach, whatever it might be. And when it comes to nature and stewardship and conservation, I think we take for granted how important it is to find something beautiful. That so many environmentalists, naturalists, people who actively steward our natural spaces started by really loving going to the beach, by taking pictures of sunsets, by noticing butterflies. And when I look at our exhibit 2020 Vision, I see a lot of people who really love nature, who may not be, say, registering for lectures with the Natural History Museum, for instance, but who are connecting with nature through photography. And I just love that. So I think on that note, I will rejoin Kathleen. Yeah, hey, Kathleen.
Hello.
Hello. So that's what we got for you. That's our pitch on nature photography through time, and how it can be useful. Do you have anything else you want to add, Kathleen?
I am really excited about 2020 Vision. It's not something, part of why I'm excited is because I love my colleagues and I'm so interested in what they're up to. And in this day and age, it's hard to maintain, and foster an excellent collegial environment. And so it's really cool to have something be so public facing that we have done. And that we have been able to help people participate in. I think this is one of the most community, this style of exhibit, which we've done before, is one of the most community curated type almost exhibits. And I also think it's really cool. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to stop and interrupt me. I know I've talked a lot already this evening, but I know since the very beginning of 2020, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have talked as a staff about what that means for our lives and our work lives, and what kinds of things we can provide to the community during this time, like digital resources, but also how we want to be documenting this time and how it intersects with our mission of connecting people to science and nature. And so I think it's really cool to see this come to fruition and to have this really beautiful, dynamic, engaging way of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the image, the Jody Frediani image of the leaves too, that reminds me also, that's one of the things that we did during the fires. Immediately after the fires, we were thinking about how we need to make sure that we are able to tell this story in the future, and that we are able to incorporate this moment into our collections. And so I do believe that you have accessioned some burned leaves, have you not?
We have. And that sort of collection is modeled off of, for any of you who came to our programming to do with the Loma Prieta anniversary, we do have a sort of Loma Prieta like memorabilia and, curio sort of collection from that time that has helped us, do exhibits and do engagement about even the anniversary 30 years later. And so we modeled the collection somewhat off of that. And I see someone, Trina, collected some leaves. I know a lot of people, a friend of mine kept getting like leaves mixed with, pages of books and things. And so we don't want to at all diminish, like, with collections like that, you have to be really careful. And we don't want to diminish like a lot of the pain that these experiences have caused, but we still want to be able to talk about it for the future. And when we do that, we want to be able to make it impactful. And so those sorts of collections are not the same as this sort of data-driven initiative that we're going to be doing with the Lightning Complex Fire project, photograph project. But it's still important for us to be able to do.
Do you take pictures out in nature, Kathleen?
Me?
Yeah.
I took a picture of an owl at Natural Bridges this very weekend, and it looks like a mangy cat. And it was the first time in a while where I've had to recognize the limits of my iPhone. I'm someone who did a little bit of manual photography growing up, didn't take pictures for a number of years, and recently have been getting into like iNaturalist and taking more pictures with my phone. And most of the time the iPhone camera is quite good for me, but it is hard to get pictures of owls fluffing themselves tucked in amongst eucalyptus bark.
Birds are just the worst. I think they're so hard. There's so many great nature photographers in town who specialize in birds and they do it well, but I don't even bother taking pictures of birds anymore because they're always disappointing to me. But yeah, I go out with my iPhone and I take pictures, and I think sometimes if I'm on a hike with someone, they get frustrated maybe with me stopping all the time to like take the picture. And then I also feel a little bit like I'm holding my phone all the time. Like I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to be out in nature. But I think that there's a way to do it where you're still directing your attention. You're paying attention. You're not using your phone as a distraction from being present. You are you're using it to be maybe like more present.
Or to acknowledge like how excited you are about something. I know I was going on a walk probably 3 or 4 months ago and didn't want to be that person on my phone because I had been giving my friend a hard time about being that person on her phone. And we were just trying to like, take a walk and like enjoy the natural world, especially in this crazy time. And there were so many vultures on the beach. Down by Sunset Beach. I have never seen that many vultures eating like carcasses of various things on the beach. And I regret not having visual evidence of that.
Yeah, I don't really think of vultures on the beach. And also, I just remembered like another anecdote about owls. Is one of the images in our show is one of those like orange sky images from one of those like days after the fire. I know someone got a picture of an owl hunting at like 3 p.m. because there was like no light because the sun was so obfuscated. And like, how neat is that? Anyways, but thank you all for joining us. We are reaching 6:30, so we will let you go, but we are going to be sharing an email that will have a lot of links from us actually. So it's going to have a survey link. We really hope you take like 2 minutes to give us some feedback so that we can continue to improve and make meaningful experiences for you all. But then there's also going to be a lot of links from the museum, things that we've created that could help to further, deepen your understanding of this topic. Kathleen has provided like so many resources that she's sharing that, helped. She built her presentation on. Do you want to speak to any of them, Kathleen?
Just that this community is like so rich in like iconic images of this like very iconic natural space in which we find ourselves. And so it's like no surprise that there are so many people doing really interesting work talking about like the landscape and how we understand these images of it and use them to understand our relationship to it. So there's a lot out there. It was hard. It was very hard to limit my time.
Yeah. Well, so thanks again for joining us. Look out for that email, and I hope that maybe some of you go out and take some nature photos this weekend. That'll be your challenge. All right. Well, thanks again. Thank you, Kathleen, and we will see you next time. I think also I'll just note, I don't think we're doing a collections close-up webinar next month. We're going to take a brief hiatus because Kathleen here, she's done a lot of these. So we're gonna kind of reset. So we won't see you for one of these next month, but still plenty coming out. Don't worry. All right. Thank you. Good night.